The words hit Cordelia May Whitmore like a physical blow. Nothing. Grandfather Josiah had left her absolutely nothing. She stood frozen in the cramped lawyer's office while the September wind rattled the windows, her worn black dress suddenly feeling like a costume in a cruel play. The other relatives shuffled their feet and avoided her eyes, their relief palpable that the burden of caring for her would not fall to them. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, hit that subscribe button because what happens next will completely change everything you thought you knew about family secrets. Cordelia's fingers trembled as she clutched the single item they had allowed her to keep, a tarnished brass key from grandfather's personal effects. The lawyer, Mr. Pemberton, cleared his throat and announced that the house would be sold to settle debts. She would have 1 week to collect her belongings and find somewhere else to live. The autumn air felt sharp against her face as she stepped outside, the key burning like a brand in her palm. What door could this possibly open when she owned nothing in the world? The answer would come from the most unexpected source, a man whose very presence in her life would scandalize the entire town and reveal secrets that had been buried for 20 years. The blacksmith's forge glowed like a beacon in the gathering dusk as Cordelia approached with hesitant steps. She had nowhere else to turn, and something about the brass key seemed to pull her toward this place. The rhythmic hammering ceased as a figure emerged from the shadows, tall and broad-shouldered with skin bronzed by fire and sun. His dark hair fell past his collar, and when their eyes met, she saw something flicker there, recognition perhaps. "I am Jacob Thunderbear," he said simply, his voice carrying the cadence of 2 worlds. "Your grandfather spoke of you often." She stared at him, confusion written across her face. Grandfather had never mentioned knowing anyone by that name. Certainly not someone who looked like he belonged more to the prairie than the town. Jacob wiped his hands on his leather apron and stepped closer, his gaze falling to the key she clutched. "Where did you find that?" he asked quietly. She explained about the lawyer's office, the humiliation, the single item they had allowed her to keep. Jacob's expression grew solemn as he examined the key without touching it. "Miss Whitmore," he said finally, "that key opens more than you could possibly imagine. Your grandfather was not the man this town believed him to be." Jacob led her through the darkness beyond the town's edge, where moonlight painted the prairie silver. The wind carried scents of sage and distant rain as they walked in silence toward a stand of cottonwoods. Hidden among the trees stood a small cabin, weathered but solid, with smoke curling from its chimney. "This was your grandfather's true home," Jacob explained as they approached the heavy wooden door. "He lived in town for appearances, but his heart belonged here." Inside, the cabin felt warm and lived in, with carved figures lining the mantelpiece and a quilt of intricate patterns covering the single bed. Jacob moved to a corner where a wooden chest sat beneath a window, its brass lock matching the key in Cordelia's trembling hand. 20 years ago, your grandfather saved my life during a blizzard," Jacob said softly. "I was 14, half dead from cold and hunger. He brought me here, nursed me back to health, taught me his trade. In return, I promised to keep his secrets and watch over what mattered most to him." The key turned with a soft click, and the chest opened to reveal documents, maps, and a leather pouch heavy with gold coins. But what caught Cordelia's breath was a daguerreotype of her grandfather standing beside a beautiful Lakota woman, their hands joined, their faces radiant with happiness. Cordelia lifted the daguerreotype with reverent fingers, studying the woman's face. "She was my grandmother," she whispered, seeing her own eyes reflected in the stranger's features. Jacob nodded, his voice gentle as autumn rain. Morningstar was her name. They married in the Lakota way, but never legally. The town would have destroyed them both. Your grandfather kept their love secret to protect her people and their unborn child. The documents beneath told a story that shattered everything Cordelia thought she knew. Deeds to vast tracts of land, mining claims worth thousands, partnerships with trading posts across 3 territories. Her grandfather had been wealthy beyond imagination, but had hidden it all to maintain his simple facade. Your father knew nothing of this when he left for California, Jacob explained. Josiah waited, hoped he would return, but yellow fever took him first. Then your mother died birthing you, and Josiah brought you home to raise as his own. Cordelia's hands shook as she counted gold pieces that gleamed like captured sunlight. But it was the final document that stopped her heart, a will written in her grandfather's careful script, leaving everything to his beloved granddaughter, provided she could find the strength to claim what was rightfully hers despite what the world might say. The weight of truth settled over Cordelia like a heavy blanket. She sat on the cabin floor surrounded by her grandfather's secrets, her entire life rewritten in the space of an evening. Half Lakota blood ran through her veins, connecting her to a heritage the town would despise. Jacob watched her carefully, firelight dancing across his weathered features as he waited for her to speak. "I understand now why you stayed hidden," she said finally, looking up at him. "You were protecting all of this, protecting me even before we met." Jacob moved closer, close enough that she could smell the wood smoke in his hair and see the concern in his dark eyes. "Your grandfather made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would help you claim what was yours. But I will not lie to you about the cost. When you present these documents, when you take ownership of these lands, the town will turn against you completely." Cordelia stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the moonlit prairie that now belonged to her. The wind whispered through the cottonwoods like ancestral voices calling her home. She thought of the humiliation at the lawyer's office, the relatives who had dismissed her so easily, the future they had planned without her. "Let them turn against me," she said with quiet strength. "I've spent my whole life trying to belong to people who never wanted me." Dawn broke pale and cold as Cordelia and Jacob rode toward town, the precious documents secured in her grandfather's leather satchel. The familiar streets looked different now, smaller somehow, as if her expanded world had diminished everything she once thought important. Jacob's steady presence beside her gave her courage as they approached the courthouse where her fate would be decided. Judge Thaddeus Morrison examined the papers with growing astonishment, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he verified each seal and signature. "These are legally binding documents," he declared, his voice carrying across the crowded room where curious townspeople had gathered. "Miss Whitmore is the rightful owner of the Whitmore holdings, which include the Silver Creek mining claims, the Riverside grazing lands, and the trading post partnerships." The banker Ezekiel Hartwell stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "This is preposterous," he sputtered. "Old Josiah lived like a pauper. Everyone knows he had nothing." But the judge's gavel silenced his protests. "The law is clear, Mr. Hartwell. Miss Whitmore inherits everything." As whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire, Cordelia felt Jacob's hand brush against hers, a silent reminder that she was no longer alone in facing whatever storm would follow. The hostility struck Cordelia like a physical force as she walked down Main Street. Storekeepers turned their backs, children were pulled away from her path, and voices dropped to hostile whispers. She heard the words clearly now, half-breed and savage, words that cut deeper because they held a grain of truth she was only beginning to understand. At Minerva Caldwell's boarding house, her belongings sat on the porch in a soggy pile, clearly deposited there without ceremony. "You cannot stay here," Minerva declared from her doorway, her arms crossed like armor. "Decent folk will not abide such scandal." Jacob appeared at Cordelia's side as if summoned by her distress, his presence causing several townspeople to step back nervously. "They fear you more than they fear me," Cordelia observed quietly. He nodded grimly as he loaded her soaked belongings into his wagon. "They fear what they do not understand, and they fear change most of all." As they drove toward the hidden cabin, Jacob's voice was soft but firm. "You have a choice to make, Cordelia. You could try to win back their approval by giving up your inheritance and living as they expect, or you can claim your true place in this world regardless of their opinions." The setting sun painted the prairie gold, and for the first time in her life, Cordelia knew exactly where she belonged. The cabin welcomed Cordelia like an embrace as Jacob carried her belongings inside. She moved through the small space, touching her grandfather's carved figures, breathing in the scent of sage and wood smoke that seemed to whisper stories of love and belonging. "This feels more like home than anywhere I have ever lived," she confessed as Jacob built up the fire against the evening chill. He watched her with eyes that held depths she was only beginning to fathom. "Your grandfather always said you had morning star spirit, her courage to love despite the world's disapproval." As flames danced in the hearth, Jacob shared stories of the woman whose blood flowed in Cordelia's veins, a healer who had chosen love over safety, acceptance over fear. "She taught your grandfather that true wealth cannot be measured in gold or land, but in the connections we forge with other souls. The space between them seemed to shimmer with possibility as Cordelia stepped closer. "I'm tired of living for other people's approval," she whispered. Jacob's calloused hand touched her face with infinite tenderness. "Then live for your own truth," he said softly. "Live for the love that your grandparents sacrificed everything to protect." Outside, the wind sang through the cottonwoods like a blessing, and Cordelia finally understood what it meant to choose her own destiny. 3 weeks passed in the cabin like a dream, suspended between worlds. Cordelia learned to cook over the open fire, to read the weather in the prairie winds, and to find peace in the rhythm of Jacob's work at the forge. Their conversations stretched deep into the night, sharing stories that revealed the wounded places in their hearts. She told him of years spent trying to earn love that was never freely given, while he spoke of walking between two worlds, never fully belonging to either. But their sanctuary could not remain hidden forever. Ezekiel Hartwell arrived one morning with the territorial marshal and 3 armed men, their faces grim with purpose. "Miss Whitmore," the marshal called out, "you are ordered to appear before the territorial court. There are questions about the legitimacy of these land claims, and allegations of fraud have been raised." Jacob stepped protectively in front of Cordelia, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle above the door. Hartwell smiled coldly. "Do not make this more difficult than necessary. We all know what happens to troublemakers in these parts." Cordelia felt ice form in her stomach as she recognized the threat beneath his words. The banker had found a way to challenge her inheritance, and now their newfound happiness hung by the thinnest of threads. The marshal's eyes held no mercy as he delivered his ultimatum. The territorial courthouse buzzed with tension as Cordelia faced her accusers. Hartwell had assembled a formidable case, claiming the documents were forgeries and that Josiah Whitmore had never possessed the wealth described in the will. His lawyer, a sharp-faced man from Denver, presented witnesses who swore they had never seen the old man with more than pocket change. The crowd murmured approval as each testimony painted Cordelia as a desperate fraud. But Jacob had not been idle during those peaceful weeks. Old Pete Garrison hobbled to the witness stand, his weathered hands clutching a leather portfolio. "I was Josiah's partner in the Silver Creek claim for 15 years, he declared in a voice that carried across the packed courtroom. "Every nugget, every deed, every dollar was earned honest. He showed me that girl's picture 100 times, told me she would inherit it all when the time was right." The portfolio contained correspondence, business records, and photographs that corroborated every detail of Cordelia's inheritance. As witness after witness confirmed her grandfather's wealth, Hartwell's confident expression crumbled. The territorial judge studied the evidence with growing certainty. "These claims are legitimate," he announced finally. "Miss Whitmore's inheritance stands as written." But as Cordelia felt relief wash over her, she noticed the murderous expression in Hartwell's eyes and knew their troubles were far from over. Hartwell struck 3 nights after the court ruling, when autumn's first frost painted the prairie silver. Cordelia woke to the acrid smell of smoke and Jacob's urgent voice calling her name. The cabin was surrounded by mounted men with torches, their faces masked by shadow and malice. "Come out now, and we might let you live," Hartwell shouted from his horse. "The half-breed and his squaw have no place in decent territory." Jacob moved with deadly purpose, gathering rifles and ammunition while Cordelia secured the precious documents in her grandfather's satchel. Through the window, she counted 8 riders, but Jacob's calm determination never wavered. "Your grandfather built this cabin with hidden passages," he explained quietly. "There's a root cellar that connects to the creek. We can escape, but we must move now." The sound of splintering wood filled the night as Hartwell's men began their assault. Jacob held them off with precise rifle shots while Cordelia crawled through the narrow tunnel her grandfather had carved beneath the floorboards. Behind them, flames consumed 20 years of memories, but ahead lay the rushing water that would carry them to safety. As they emerged beside the moonlit creek, Cordelia realized that losing the cabin had freed them from the past. Now, they could build something entirely their own, something no one could ever take away. Spring came early to the new cabin Jacob built beside the creek, where wildflowers bloomed in profusion and the cottonwoods whispered songs of renewal. Cordelia stood in the doorway, watching her husband work the forge he had constructed in the clearing, his movements graceful and sure. The territorial marshal had arrested Hartwell for arson and attempted murder, and a banker now awaited trial in the Denver jail, his schemes finally exposed. The town had slowly begun to change as well. Old Pete Garrison spread the truth about Josiah Whitmore's character, and some of the more decent folks started acknowledging Cordelia with respectful nods. She had used part of her inheritance to fund a school that welcomed all children regardless of their heritage, and gradually the barriers of fear began to crumble. Jacob's gentle strength and obvious devotion to his wife softened even the hardest hearts. As evening painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jacob joined her on the porch they had built together. In her hands, she held a carved figure he had made, a woman with flowing hair dancing in the wind, free and unafraid. "Have you ever found belonging in unexpected places?" she mused, thinking of everyone who might be listening to their story. Tell us about your moment of acceptance in the comments. Sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden in plain sight, waiting for us to find the courage to claim them.